effacing when ambition runs thickest in mortal hearts. Napoleon seeks it desperately in his final campaigns, sensing perhaps that only such power could reverse his fortunes. He dies in exile, reaching for a spear that remains forever beyond his grasp. And then, in the shadow of the 20th century, another hand closes around its shaft. Adolf Hitler stands before it in Vienna's museum, a failed artist with eyes like winter storms. He stares at the blade for hours, breathing in its ancient promise, feeling its whisper of absolute power. When he seizes Austria, he seizes the spear. When he marches across Europe, the weapon rides with his armies, tucked away in some secret vault, some private shrine to his twisted ambitions. For years, it seems the spear has chosen its vessel well. The Third Reich spreads like plague across the continent, unstoppable, invincible, but the spear's curse is patient, inevitable as sunrise. Watch how it unfolds. The moment Hitler's power reaches its zenith, the weapon abandons him. Allied forces discover it in a salt mine, wrapped in silk like a sleeping serpent. Within hours of losing his precious relic, the Fuhrer puts a gun to his head in a Berlin bunker, and the empire that would last 1,000 years dies with him. Today, the spear rests again behind glass in Vienna, its blade dark with age and mystery. Tourists file past it daily, unaware of the weight of its gaze, the hunger in its steel. Scholars debate its authenticity with the passion of theologians, measuring its iron against history's testimony. But authenticity misses the deeper truth that some objects transcend their origins, becoming vessels for forces older than empires, older than names. The spear has carved its legend, not in stone, but in the rise and fall of those who dared to claim it. Each bearer convinced themselves they were chosen, that they alone could master its power. Each discovered too late that the spear does not serve it, consumes. It offers the world with one hand, while sharpening the blade with the other, waiting for that moment when hubris reaches its peak and the curse can claim another soul, perhaps. The spear sleeps now, sated by centuries of blood and betrayal. Perhaps it dreams of future hands that will lift it from its case, future empires that will rise and fall by its will. Or perhaps it simply waits, patient as stone, knowing that human nature will always provide another vessel for its terrible gift. The rain continues to fall against the palace windows tonight, washing the stones clean, but never the memory. And somewhere in that sacred darkness, behind glass thick as winter ice, the spear of destiny lies dreaming of the next soul, brave enough for foolish enough to believe they can master fate itself, in the heart of Budapest, where the Danube flows. Dark as medieval wine, there sits a crown that should never have been forged, the holy crown of Hungary, they call it now, though holiness seems a stranger to its bent and twisted form. Its peak tilts at an unnatural angle, as if the weight of heaven itself has pressed down upon it, finding it wanting. The cathedral bells of Székesfehérvár rang across the Hungarian plains in the year 1000, announcing the coronation of King Stephen I. But this tale does not begin with that saintly king, whose crown rests easy upon his brow, and whose reign brings peace to the Magyar lands. No, our story finds its birth in the shadows of the 12th century, when ambition wore a different face and bore a different name. King Stephen II ascends the throne in 1116, his heart heavy with the burden of following legends. The original crown has vanished into myth and monastery walls, leaving the new king to commission a replacement worthy of his bloodline. Byzantine craftsmen arrive like pilgrims, bearing gifts, gold thread spun from Constantinople's dreams, jewels that once adorned the robes of emperors, enamels painted with the faces of saints and angels. For months, they labor in secret chambers beneath the royal palace, their hammers singing against precious metal, their furnaces burning bright as fallen stars. But something goes wrong in that darkness. Perhaps a measurement miscalculated, perhaps a moment's inattention as molten gold flows into its mold, or perhaps as the people will whisper in years to come, something far more sinister than human error guides their hands. When the crown emerges from its forge, it bears a flaw that catches every eye. The cross at its peak tilts at a strange angle, leaning like a grave marker in an old cemetery. The craftsmen claim it is a minor imperfection, easily corrected. But King Stephen II gazes upon it with eyes that see deeper truths. In that twisted angle, he reads an omen, a message written in gold and precious stones. Still, he places it upon his head, feeling its weight settle against his skull, like destiny itself. The coronation proceeds with all proper ceremony, though observers note how the crown's shadow falls strangely across the king's face, how its tilted cross seems to point not toward heaven, but toward some darker horizon. The curse begins subtly, as curses often do. King Stephen's reign starts well enough. Harvests prove abundant. Borders remain secure. The nobility bend the knee with appropriate deference. But slowly, like poison seeping through royal veins, misfortune creeps into the kingdom. Border skirmishes escalate into full warfare. Trusted advisors whisper treachery in midnight chambers. The king's own son dies young, struck down by fever that no physician can cure. Each tragedy strikes when the crown sits heaviest upon Stephen's brow. During state ceremonies and royal audiences, when its weight presses deepest into his skull, courtiers begin to notice how their king's face grows gaunt beneath its golden burden, how his eyes take on the hollow look of a man who has seen too far into the future and found only darkness waiting there. King Stephen II dies in 1131, though the manner of his death remains shrouded in whispers. Some say poison, others the plague. Still others claim he simply wasted away beneath the crown's unnatural weight. What remains certain is that the crown passes to new hands, carrying with it the strange curse of its tilted form. King Bela II takes the throne, blind from birth, yet somehow seeing clearly enough to recognize the doom that comes with royal gold. But tradition demands he wear the crown, and so he does, feeling its crooked weight settle upon his head like an unbalanced burden. His reign brings civil war, brother fighting brother, the kingdom bleeding itself white in conflicts that seem to spring from nowhere and everywhere at once. The pattern repeats across centuries, each new king hoping to break the curse through will or wisdom or simple, stubborn denial. King Geza II wears it to his coronation and watches his kingdom fragment into warring duchies. King Stephen III places it upon his head and sees his reign consumed by succession disputes that tear Hungary apart like wolves fighting over a carcass. By The 13th century, the crown's reputation has grown so dark that some kings refuse to wear it, choosing lesser circlets for their coronations. But tradition proves stronger than superstition, and eventually each ruler succumbs to the weight of ceremony, placing the tilted crown upon their head and sealing their fate in gold and precious stones. The crown survives invasions and revolutions, world wars and communist regimes, always somehow finding its way back to Hungarian soil. Today it rests in the Parliament building in Budapest, displayed in a chamber designed to showcase Hungary's most precious treasures. Tourists photograph its bent cross, unaware of the centuries of blood and betrayal that stain its golden surface. Scholars offer rational explanations for its tilted form damage during transport. The weight of age, simple craftsmanship flaws from 1,000 years past. But the tilt remains, defying every attempt at repair or correction, as if the crown itself resists any effort to straighten what was meant to be crooked, perhaps. The curse lies not in supernatural forces, but in the weight of expectation itself, the impossible burden placed upon mortal shoulders by divine right and royal tradition, or perhaps, as the old stories whisper, some objects are simply born wrong, forged in moments when heaven and earth align poorly and creation itself goes askew. The Danube continues to flow past Budapest tonight, its waters dark with the memory of all the blood that has stained its banks. And in the Parliament building, behind glass as thick as a king's pride, the crooked crown waits, patient as stone, ready to test the next soul, brave enough to place it upon their head and discover whether they can bear the weight of heavens. Rejection in the misted fields of Gloucestershire, where Roman roads still whisper beneath English soil, a farmer's plough once struck something that should have remained buried. The year was 1785, and the earth gave up its secret, reluctantly, a golden ring, heavy with age and dark with purpose. Upon its surface, carved in letters that had not seen sunlight for over a millennium, a name, Sinitianus. But this ring was not alone in its awakening. 43 miles away, in the shadow of an ancient temple to the god Nodens, archaeologists would later unearth a lead tablet, thin as hope and twice as bitter. Upon its surface, words had been scratched with the desperate fury of a wronged soul. For the god Nodin, Silvionus has lost a ring and has donated half its value to Nodens. Among those named Sinitianus, do not allow health until he brings it to the temple of Nodens. A curse, written in lead and sealed with divine fury. A ring, golden and gleaming, with guilt, and between them, a story that would echo through 17 centuries, inspiring myths and legends, speaking to the dark places where human hearts turn black with vengeance. Picture, if you will, Roman Britain in the 4th century. The empire still holds sway, but its grip grows loose as winter frost. In this borderland between civilization and wilderness, a man named Silvionus feels the weight of betrayal settle upon his shoulders like a funeral shroud. His ring, perhaps a family heirloom, perhaps a token of love, certainly something precious beyond its mere gold, has been stolen. And he knows who took it. Sen Ishinus. The name burns in Silvionus's throat like poison, shapes itself on his tongue like a prayer to darker gods. Perhaps they were friends once, or business partners, or simply neighbors in the small community that clustered around the temple complex. But friendship crumbles beneath the weight of theft, and trust dies harder than love. Unable to retrieve his property through earthly means, Silvianus turns to older powers. He makes his way to the temple of Nodens, the Celtic god of healing and hunting, whose worship the Romans have grudgingly permitted in these far-flung provinces. There, in chambers thick with incense and heavy with divine presence, he purchases a curse tablet defixio. The Romans call it a legal document filed in the court of heaven. With trembling hands or steady fury, history does not record which. Silvianus scratches his petition into the lead. Half the ring's value he offers to the god, the traditional fee for divine intervention. But his price is not gold or silver. What Silvianus wants is suffering, pure and distilled as morning dew. Let Sinitianus know, no peace, no health, no comfort, until the ring returns to its rightful place in Nodens' temple. The cursed tablet is buried beneath the temple floor, consigned to darkness and the slow working of divine justice. And perhaps, in some chamber lit by stolen candles, Sinitianus feels a chill touch his spine as unseen forces begin their slow and patient work. What follows remains lost to history's silence. Did Sinitianus return the ring, purchasing health with humility? Did he die clutching the golden band, defiant to his final breath? Or did he, perhaps, escape the god's attention entirely, living out his days in ignorant bliss while divine vengeance searched for him in vain? We know only that both ring and curse survived their creators, buried in British soil for over 14 centuries, waiting for modern hands to disturb their rest and bring their story back to light. The ring emerged first, gleaming in farmers' fields, passed from collector to collector like some beautiful contagion. The cursed tablet followed decades later, its lead surface dark with age, but its words sharp as the day they were carved. Scholars who studied both artifacts began to notice strange coincidences. The dates matched, the geography aligned, the names created echoes across the centuries. But one scholar saw deeper than the rest, recognizing in this ancient tale the bones of something far more significant. Professor J.R.R. Tolkien walked the same countryside where these relics were found, taught at Oxford where they were studied, breathed the same misted air that once carried Silvianus's curses and Sinitianus's name. In the tale of a golden ring that brought doom to its bearer, he found inspiration for a story that would reshape fantasy literature forever. The One Ring, forged in Mount Doom and bearing its own curse, was born from the marriage of Celtic mythology and Roman vengeance, filtered through the imagination of a man who understood the power of ancient objects to shape modern souls. Today, the Ring of Sinitianus rests in a museum display case, its gold still bright despite centuries of burial. Visitors pause before it, reading placards that explain its historical significance, its connection to one of literature's most beloved works. But few linger long enough to feel the weight of its true story, not the tale of hobbits and heroes, but the older, darker narrative of theft and vengeance, of divine justice purchased with lead and fury. The cursed tablet lies nearby, its words translated into modern English for contemporary eyes. But translation cannot capture the desperate fury that guided the hand that carved those letters, cannot convey the weight of divine threat that settled upon ancient shoulders like a burial shroud. Perhaps the curse found its mark. Perhaps it did not. Perhaps Sinishunus lived in torment until he returned what he had stolen. Or perhaps he escaped justice through cunning or simple distance. But in the end, the question that haunts is not whether the curse worked, but whether it ever truly ends. For curses, like rings of power, have their own momentum, their own life beyond their creator's intentions. And in a world where ancient stories inspire modern myths, where Roman vengeance finds new expression in tales of Middle-earth, perhaps Silvianus's curse still works its slow magic, transforming theft into literature, vengeance into wonder, and two long-dead enemies into eternal inspiration for all who believe in the power of objects to carry human dreams and nightmares across the centuries. The fields of Gloucestershire lie quiet tonight, their secrets mostly surrendered to archaeological trowels and scholarly theories. But somewhere beneath the English soil, other objects wait, other stories sleep, other curses bide their time until the moment comes for their own awakening. In the golden cities of ancient Lydia, where the world's first coins gleamed in merchant hands and King Croesus learned that wealth itself could be a curse, there stood a palace that blazed like captured sunlight. Every surface caught the light golden plates, golden goblets, golden statues of gods and beasts, and at their heart one figure that seemed to burn with inner fire, a lion, small enough to hold in mortal hands, crafted from gold so pure it seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. The year was 546 BCE, when the Persian host thundered across the Lydian plain like the wrath of distant gods. Cyrus the Great rode at their head, his eyes fixed upon the richest kingdom in the ancient world, his heart heavy with the weight of manifest destiny. Behind the walls of Sardis, King Croesus watched the dust clouds rise on the horizon and felt the chill touch of prophecy fulfilled. Years before, the oracle at Delphi had whispered her riddle into his eager ears. If you cross the river, a great empire will be destroyed. Croesus heard only victory in those words, gold deaf to their deeper meaning. Now, with Persian spears glittering like deadly stars beyond his gates, he understood too late which empire the gods had marked for ruin. The siege was brief but brutal. Persian efficiency met Lydian luxury, and luxury proved the weaker force. The golden palace that had taken generations to build fell in a single day, its treasures flowing into Persian hands like wine from a broken amphora. Soldiers who had never seen such wealth wept at its beauty, even as they loaded it onto pack trains bound for Persepolis. Among all the treasures, the golden lion drew every eye. No larger than a house cat, but infinitely more precious, it crouched in eternal readiness, its mane flowing like frozen flame, its eyes set with gems that seemed to hold captured starlight. The craftsman who forged it had died centuries before, taking the secret of its creation to his grave, but his masterwork lived on, growing more beautiful with each passing year. As if time itself polished its perfection, Cyrus claimed it personally. This jewel among jewels, recognizing in its fierce beauty something that matched his own imperial ambitions. The lion rode with him back to Persepolis, where it took pride of place among the treasures of a dozen conquered kingdoms. But from the moment it entered Persian hands, shadow began to gather around its golden glory. The first sign came within months of the conquest. A fever swept through Cyrus's army, claiming veteran warriors who had survived 100 battles. The king himself fell ill, though he recovered while others perished. His soothsayers whispered of curses and divine displeasure, but Cyrus dismissed their fears as the superstitions of lesser minds. The lion passed from Cyrus to his son Cambyses, who carried it into Egypt like a talisman of conquest. The campaign succeeded. The Nile Valley fell beneath Persian rule, but Cambyses never returned from his victories. Madness took him in the desert, or poison in his wine, or simply the weight of empire pressing too heavily upon mortal shoulders. The lion came home without its master, carried by generals who spoke in whispers of the strange accidents that had befallen their king. Through the generations that followed, the pattern repeated with the consistency of sunrise. Each Persian king who claimed the lion saw his reign marked by triumph and tragedy in equal measure. Darius the Great built an empire that stretched from the Aegean to the Indus, but died dreaming of Greek defeats he would never avenge. Xerxes led the greatest army the world had ever seen against tiny Athens, only to watch his ships burn at Salamis while the lion glowed in his treasure chamber like a golden curse. The statue survived the fall of Persia, claimed by Alexander as he carved his own legend across the ancient world. It rode with him to India's edge, witnessed his tears when there were no more worlds to conquer, and returned to Babylon in the baggage train of a god who died at 33, master of everything except his own mortality. Through Hellenistic kingdoms and Roman conquest, through the rise of Christianity and the birth of Islam, the golden lion wandered like some beautiful plague, bringing glory and ruin in equal measure to all who claimed it. Byzantine emperors clutched it close, while barbarians hammered at their gates. Crusader lords carried it to Jerusalem and died in desert sand. Ottoman sultans locked it in their treasure vaults and watched their empire slowly crumble from within. The last confirmed sighting came in the archives of Topkapi Palace, inventoried among the treasures of Sultan Mehmed IV in the 17th century. A single line in Ottoman Turkish, clinical in its brevity. One lion, gold, of ancient make, origin, unknown. Then silence, as if history itself had forgotten the artifact that had shaped so many of its pages. Some say it was melted down during one of the empire's financial crises, its gold transformed into coins that carried its curse into merchant hands across the known world. Others claim it was stolen by European collectors, smuggled west to grace private collections, where its beauty could be appreciated without the burden of its history. But perhaps the truest answer lies in recognition of what the lion truly represented. Not just a work of art or a symbol of wealth, but a manifestation of that ancient hubris that believes mortal hands can hold divine power without consequence. Every king who claimed it thought himself different, special, chosen by fate to master what had mastered all his predecessors. Each discovered, too late, that some treasures are too heavy for human hearts to bear. The golden lion sleeps now, wherever it rests, its curse, perhaps exhausted by centuries of fulfillment, or simply waiting for the next. In museums and private collections, in melted gold and scattered memories, in the dreams of archaeologists and the nightmares of historians, it continues to prowl, beautiful and terrible, as the day it first emerged from its creator's forge, and perhaps that is curse enough to know that somewhere in the darkness, beauty and doom continue their eternal dance. waiting for the next hand bold enough to reach out and claim a treasure that has never belonged to anyone but ruin itself. In the shadow-draped monasteries of medieval Poland, where monks bent over illuminated manuscripts by candlelight and prayers rose like incense into cathedral darkness, there once existed a book that should never have been written, bound in leather, so black it seemed to drink the light, its pages filled with words that promised dominion over kingdoms and souls alike. It was known only as the Black Book of Bolesław, and its very existence was a sin against heaven and earth. King Bolesław II ascended the throne of Poland in 1058, his heart burning with ambitions too large for any mortal crown to contain, piecing itself together from the fragments of earlier glory. But where his father had been content to rebuild, Bolesław dreamed of conquest, of a Poland that would stretch from the Baltic to the Black Sea, an empire to rival Rome itself. In the secret chambers beneath Wallcastle, accessible only through passages known to the king and his most trusted servants, strange visitors began to arrive under cover of darkness. Men who spoke no Christian tongue, women whose eyes held knowledge older than Christ's cross, scholars from Constantinople and Alexandria who carried scrolls that bore no bishop's seal. They came bearing gifts of wisdom that the Church had declared forbidden, knowledge that existed beyond the boundaries of prayer and sacrament. What passed between them and the king in those midnight hours remains lost to history's discretion. But the fruit of their labors emerged in the form of a tome, unlike any other in Christian Europe, bound between covers of leather so dark they seemed cut from night itself, its pages filled with text that hurt the eyes to read. The Black Book promised its reader power beyond the dreams of ordinary kings. The volume contained no Christian prayers, no appeals to saints or angels. Instead, its words reached toward older powers, darker sources of strength that predated the cross and would outlast its memory. Spells for bending men's wills to royal command, incantations for seeing beyond the veil of present into the golden certainty of future triumph, rituals for binding a soul so tightly to earthly power that death itself would hesitate to claim it. Bolesław studied its pages with the fevered intensity of a man who had glimpsed infinity and found it within his grasp. Night after night, he bent over its dark wisdom, his crown reflecting candlelight. His courtiers began to notice changes, how his eyes burned with inner fire during council meetings, how his voice carried new authority that made strong men tremble, how his very presence seemed to bend reality to his will. For a time, it appeared, the dark knowledge worked its promised magic. Bolesław's armies swept across Eastern Europe like divine judgment, crushing resistance with supernatural efficiency. His enemies fell before him not just through military might, but through strange coincidences, key leaders dying suddenly in their sleep, allied kingdoms turning against each other for no apparent reason, supply lines failing at precisely the moments that would ensure Polish victory. The king's triumph reached its zenith with his coronation as King of the Poles and Lithuanians, a ceremony that some claimed was attended by shadows that had no earthly source. Standing before the altar with his crown glowing like captured starlight, Bolesław seemed to embody the very essence of earthly power. The Black Book had delivered on its promises, transforming a provincial ruler into the master of nations. But Power purchased through such means carries its own price, and the bill comes due with the inevitability of dawn following darkness. The first crack in Bolesław's perfect reign appeared in his relationship with the Church, specifically with Bishop Stanislaus of Szczepano, a man whose holiness shone so brightly that it exposed the shadows clinging to the royal court. Bishop had long suspected the source of his king's unnatural success, had heard whispers of midnight rituals and forbidden texts. When he finally confronted Bolesław directly, demanding the destruction of whatever dark influences had corrupted the crown, the king's rage burned with fury that seemed to come from beyond his own soul. In a moment of passion that would echo through Polish history, Bolesław drew his sword and struck down the holy man, spilling sacred blood upon cathedral stones. The murder of Bishop Stanislaus proved to be the moment when the Black Book's power turned against its master. The kingdom that had been held together by supernatural force began to fragment with supernatural speed. Nobles who had bent the knee in terror now rose in righteous rebellion. Allied kingdoms that had trembled before Polish armies suddenly found courage to strike back. Most devastating of all, the very people who had once cheered their conquering king now turned against him with a hatred that seemed to spring from the depths of their souls. Within months of the bishop's murder, Bolesław found himself not master of an empire, but fugitive from his own kingdom. The Black Book's promises of eternal rule had curdled into the bitter reality of exile and disgrace. He fled to Hungary, carrying with him only the clothes on his back and the terrible knowledge contained within those midnight black covers. History records that Bolesław II died in exile, broken and forgotten, but the fate of his infernal tome remains shrouded in mystery. Some claim he burned it before his death, seeking redemption for his sins through the destruction of the thing that had damned him. Others whisper that he passed it on, selling his soul's companion to other ambitious hearts, hungry for power at any price. Through the centuries that followed, rumors of the Black Book surfaced like bubbles, rising from some dark underwater source. Monasteries reported strange deaths among their brothers, monks found dead in their cells with expressions of terror frozen upon their faces and no mark of violence upon their bodies. Always, these tragedies followed the acquisition of ancient manuscripts from anonymous donors, texts that disappeared as mysteriously as they had arrived. The pattern repeated across medieval Europe: ambitious nobles rising to unexpected power, their success attributed to supernatural assistance, their inevitable falls marked by madness and betrayal. And always, somewhere in the shadows of their courts, observers reported glimpses of a book bound in leather so black it seemed to devour light itself. Perhaps the Black Book exists still, hidden in some private collection or monastery vault, its pages waiting for the next soul desperate enough to trade eternal peace for temporary power. Perhaps it was destroyed long ago, its ashes scattered to winds that carried its curse to the four corners of the earth. Or perhaps, as the darkest legends whisper, it exists now not as a physical object, but as something far more dangerous, an idea, a possibility, a promise that power can be obtained through means that dare not speak their names. The monasteries of Poland stand quiet tonight, but somewhere in the darkness between the lines of approved doctrine, in the shadows that gather at the edges of candlelight, the echo of forbidden knowledge continues to whisper to hearts brave enough or foolish enough to listen. And in that whisper, the Black Book of Bolsward lives on, patient as damnation itself, waiting for the next king desperate enough to believe that some prices are worth paying. Beneath the Judean hills, where desert winds carry the scent of ancient sorrows and modern excavations disturb sleep that has lasted to millennia, archaeologists once uncovered fragments of a tomb that should have remained sealed forever. The sarcophagus of Herod, the great Herod the builder, Herod the terrible. Herod the cursed lay, shattered across the floor of a hillside cave, its precious stones scattered like tears, its golden ornaments tarnished with the patina of divine judgment. The king had ruled from 37 to 04 BCE, and history remembers him as a paradox wrapped in purple and sealed with blood. He built temples and palaces that rivaled Rome's greatest achievements, transformed Jerusalem into a city of white marble and golden dreams. Yet this same hand that created beauty ordered the slaughter of Bethlehem's children, making himself forever the villain in Christianity's foundational story. The shadow that pursued the infant Christ through history's most sacred narrative. When death finally claimed him, and the manner of his dying was terrible. His body consumed by worms, and his spirit tormented by visions of the innocent blood he had spilled. Herod's final command echoed with all the arrogance that had marked his reign. Let his tomb be a monument to match his achievements, a resting place carved from the living rock of Judea, sealed with curses in a dozen languages to ensure his eternal rest. The sarcophagus itself was a masterwork of funerary art, carved from red stone that seemed to pulse with its own inner fire. Golden bands encircled it like royal serpents, and precious gems studded its surface like stars plucked from the night sky. Upon its lid, craftsmen had carved the image of the king himself, not as death had left him, but as he wished to be remembered, eternal, untouchable by time or judgment. For nearly 2,000 years, the tomb kept its secrets well. Earthquakes shook the hills, empires rose and fell, but Herod's resting place remained hidden, protected by rock slides and the simple passage of time. Local Bedouins spoke of the area in whispers, claiming that strange lights sometimes danced above the hillside, and that those who camped too close to the hidden grave found their dreams filled with the screams of slaughtered children. The modern age brought different tools to the ancient search. Professor Elhud Netzer arrived in 1972 with archaeological credentials and scientific methodology, convinced that careful excavation could succeed where treasure hunters and religious pilgrims had failed. For decades, he combed the harsh landscape of Herodium, following tantalizing clues through historical texts and topographical surveys. In 2007, his persistence was finally rewarded. Deep within the artificial mountain that Herod had built as his fortress Palestum, Netzer's team uncovered the fragments of what could only be the royal sarcophagus, broken, scattered, deliberately destroyed by some ancient enemy, but unmistakably the burial place of Judea's most notorious king. But from the moment the first fragment was lifted from its 2-millennium rest, shadow began to gather around the excavation. Professor Netzer, who had spent 35 years of his life searching for this tomb, began to complain of strange dreams, visions of ancient Jerusalem burning while spectral figures watched from palace walls. His health, robust despite his advanced age, started to fail in ways that puzzled his doctors. Other members of the excavation team reported similar experiences. Photographers found their equipment malfunctioning at crucial moments, their cameras capturing shadows that hadn't been visible to the naked eye. Graduate students working on the site began to suffer from nightmares so vivid they feared sleep. Dreams filled with the sound of marching soldiers and the cries of dying children. The curse seemed to reach beyond the immediate dig site. Scholars who studied the sarcophagus fragments began to experience a series of inexplicable accidents and illnesses. One archaeologist, previously healthy, developed a mysterious blood disorder. Another suffered a psychological breakdown, claiming that he could hear Herod's voice whispering in ancient Aramaic, demanding that his rest not be disturbed. Most disturbing of all was the fate that befell Professor Netzer himself, the man who had achieved his life's greatest dream. The discovery of Herod's tomb began to waste away as if something vital was being drawn from his very essence. Colleagues who visited him in his final months spoke of a brilliant mind slowly clouding over, of a determined spirit growing brittle and strange. In 2010, Professor Netzer died suddenly while working at the Herodium site, collapsing among the very ruins he had spent his career uncovering. His death was officially attributed to a heart attack, but those who knew him best whispered of something more sinister. They spoke of how his final weeks had been marked by an obsession with returning the sarcophagus fragments to their original resting place, as if some part of him had come to understand that certain discoveries are too dangerous to pursue today. The fragments of Herod's sarcophagus rest in climate-controlled storage at Hebrew University, studied by scholars who handled them with latex gloves and clinical detachment. But those who work closely with the relics speak in hushed tones of the atmosphere that surrounds the heaviness in the air, a sense of presence that makes the skin crawl and the heart race. The curse of Herod's tomb may be nothing more than coincidence and suggestion, the power of ancient reputation working upon modern minds already primed for mystery and dread. But, in the end, perhaps the nature of the curse matters less than its persistence. For 2,000 years, the memory of Herod's crimes has stained the very stones of Judea. His name remains synonymous with tyranny and child murder. His legacy, a warning about the corruption of absolute power. Maybe the real curse is not supernatural, but historical. The way certain names become vessels for humanity's darkest impulses. How certain objects carry the weight of collective memory across the centuries. To disturb Herod's tomb is to confront not just ancient death but ancient evil. To handle fragments that once held the remains of a man whose choices echo still in Christmas carols and passion plays. The Judean hills lie quiet tonight, scarred by excavations but still holding their secrets close. And somewhere in those climate-controlled storage rooms, red stone fragments wait in their labeled boxes, carrying within their mineral structure the memory of a king who learned too late that some kinds of power exact prices that death itself cannot discharge. In the gilded chambers of the Louvre, where madness once wore a crown and shadows danced in polished surfaces, there once stood a mirror that reflected more than mortal eyes were meant to see. Crafted by Venetian masters in an age when glass was more precious than gold, it found its way into the possession of Charles VI of France. The king history would remember as Charles the Mad, though perhaps madness found him through his own reflection. The year was 1380, when young Charles ascended the throne, his mind bright as spring morning, his reign promising golden decades of peace and prosperity for France. But the crown of the Valois carried its own weight of shadows, and somewhere in the palace of St. Paul, among treasures gathered from across Europe, waited an object that would transform promise into nightmare. The mirror had arrived as part of a wedding gift from Venice, a diplomatic offering that spoke of trade alliances and shared prosperity. Craftsmen of Murano had labored for months to create it, glass so perfect it seemed like captured water, silver backing so pure it reflected not just images but souls themselves. The frame bore carved angels whose faces seemed to shift in candlelight, their expressions alternating between benediction and warning depending upon the angle of view. At first, Charles found in the mirror nothing but pleasure. He would stand before it during the elaborate ceremonies of royal dressing, watching as courtiers arranged his robes and adjusted his crown, admiring the image of kingship that stared back with eyes bright with young ambition. The glass showed him everything he wished to see: majesty, power, destiny, written in the line of his shoulders and the tilt of his chin. But mirrors, like crowns, can be treacherous companions. In 1392, during what should have been a routine journey through the forest of Le Mans Balm, something snapped in the king's mind like a bowstring drawn too tight. He drew his sword against his own companions, attacking men who had served him faithfully for years, screaming that enemies surrounded him on all sides. When the madness passed, he remembered nothing, but the episode marked the beginning of a descent that would define the remainder of his reign. In the quiet hours that followed his first attack, courtiers noticed a change in the king's relationship with his Venetian mirror. Where once he had gazed into it with simple vanity, now he stood before it for hours at a time, his lips moving in silent conversation with his reflection. Palace servants whispered of voices heard from the royal chambers in the deep of night, not one voice, but two, as if the king were holding long discussions with someone who answered back in tones identical to his own. The pattern of madness began to establish itself with the regularity of seasons. For months at a time, Charles would govern with wisdom and justice, his mind clear as mountain water, his decisions marked by the intelligence that had made him beloved in his early reign. But then the darkness would descend, and the king would disappear into his private chambers, emerging only to stand before his mirror, staring into its depths as if seeking answers that only his reflection could provide. During these episodes, courtiers reported phenomena that chilled their blood. The king would argue with his mirror image, accusing it of treason, of plotting against the crown, of whispering lies that poisoned the kingdom. Sometimes he would rage at the glass, striking it with his fists until his knuckles bled. Yet the mirror never cracked, never showed the slightest sign of damage, despite the violence directed against it. Stranger still were the moments when the king seemed to be receiving instructions from his reflection. He would lean close to the glass, his ear pressed against its cold surface, nodding as if listening to whispered counsel. Commands would emerge from these session-seeded declarations of war, unexpected pardons for condemned criminals, changes in policy that seemed to spring from nowhere and serve no earthly purpose. The kingdom suffered under the weight of its monarch's divided mind. During his lucid periods, Charles would try to undo the damage wrought by his madness. But the mirror's influence seemed to grow stronger with each passing year. The glass became his counselor, his confessor, his constant companion in the lonely hours when sanity seemed a distant memory. Queen Isabeau watched her husband's descent with growing horror, noting how his gaze would seek out reflective surfaces even when the great mirror was not present. Water basins, polished armor, even the pupils of human eyes seemed to draw his attention, as if he were searching for his other self, the reflection that had become more real to him than the flesh and blood world around him. In 1422, Charles VI died in his bed, his final words reportedly directed not to his family or his confessor, but to his reflection in a hand mirror held by a trembling servant. What he saw there in those last moments, what final counsel he received from the image that had guided and tormented him for 30 years, remains one of history's darkest mysteries. The great Venetian mirror disappeared in the chaos that followed. The king's death, spirited away by servants who feared its influence or perhaps coveted its beauty despite its reputation. For decades it vanished from history, becoming the stuff of legend and whispered tales in the corridors of European palaces. But like all cursed objects, the mirror refused to remain hidden forever. It surfaced in the court of Louis XI, where it drove that paranoid monarch to even greater extremes of suspicion and cruelty. It passed through the hands of nobles and merchants, each owner reporting the same phenomena: gradual loss of distinction between self and reflection, a growing sense that the image in the glass possessed its own will and wisdom. The Revolution of 1789 swept away much of France's royal patrimony, and with it, the mirror vanished into the revolutionary chaos. Some claimed it was destroyed by Republican mobs who smashed symbols of royal excess. Others whispered that it was saved by loyal servants, hidden away to await more favorable times. In the centuries since, fragments of mirrors claiming descent from Charles VI's cursed glass have appeared at auctions and in private collections across Europe. Each comes with its own tales of misfortune owners who began talking to their reflections, families torn apart by sudden madness, collectors who found themselves unable to look away from their own images until death claimed them in their mirror's embrace. Perhaps these are merely fragments of ordinary glass, their reputation manufactured by dealers seeking to inflate their value. But perhaps, as the old stories suggest, some objects possess their own life, their own will to survive and continue their dark work across the centuries. Perhaps the mirror of Charles the Mad lives on in 1,000 shattered pieces, each shard carrying a fragment of its power to transform reflection into obsession, vanity into madness, self-awareness into self-destruction. The chambers of Versailles stand empty tonight, their mirrors reflecting nothing but shadows and tourist groups. But somewhere in the darkness between image and reality, between the self and its reflection, the ghost of that original glass continues to whisper, promising its viewers everything they wish to see, while slowly stealing away everything they truly are in the frozen steppes where empires are born and heroes die young. There once gleamed a sword that gods themselves had forged in starfire and tempered in the tears of conquered nations. The sword of Mars, they called it, though Mars was merely the Roman name for powers older than civilization, older than language itself. In the hands of Attila the Hun, it became the instrument of divine wrath, the blade that carved empires from the living flesh of the world. The weapon's origin lay shrouded in the mythology of the steppes, where shamans spoke of a time when the sky god himself walked among mortals, his footsteps leaving lakes, his breath creating winds that could topple mountains. In that primordial age, when the boundary between heaven and earth was thin as morning mist, the god had grown weary of mortal weakness and forged a weapon to test whether humanity deserved to inherit the world. The blade emerged from celestial fires already thirsting for blood, its steel darker than midnight, but gleaming with inner light that hurt mortal eyes to behold. Upon its surface, runes writhed like living things, spelling out prophecies in languages that predated human speech. The crossguard bore the image of a wolf's head, mouth agape in eternal howl, while the pommel was set with a stone that pulsed like a captured heartbeat, crimson as fresh blood, cold as winter death. 4 generations beyond counting. The sword lay hidden in the sacred places of the steppes, waiting for hands worthy of its terrible gift. Shamans dreamed of its location, but dared not seek it out, knowing that only one chosen by fate itself could draw it from its earthly sheath and survive the claiming. That moment came in the year 440, when a young shepherd discovered the blade, protruding from the earth like some dark flower bloomed from hell itself. The boy ran to his khan with news of the marvel, and Attila rode out to see this portent with his own eyes. The moment his fingers closed around the hilt, power flowed through him like liquid fire, and he knew that his destiny had finally revealed itself with the sword of Mars in his grasp. Attila transformed from tribal leader to force of nature, his very name becoming synonymous with divine judgment upon a corrupt world. The weapon seemed to guide his strategies, whispering tactical genius into his mind during the long winter nights, showing him visions of enemy weakness and allied strength. Under its influence, he united the fractured Hun tribes into a war machine that would shake the foundations of both empires Rome and Constantinople. Trembling equally before his approach, the sword drank deep of imperial blood as Attila's armies swept across Europe like a plague of locusts. In Gaul, it severed the heads of Roman legionnaires who had thought themselves invincible. At the gates of Constantinople, it glowed with anticipation as Emperor Theodosius II knelt in the dust, offering tribute rather than face the weapon's edge in battle. Across the Balkans and into Italy, the blade carved a path of devastation that would scar the landscape for generations. But the sword of Mars, like all weapons of divine origin, carried within it the seeds of its bearer's doom. Power absolute corrupts absolutely, and even Attila began to feel the weight of the weapon's hunger, the way it whispered constantly of new conquests, new enemies to devour, new empires to topple. Sleep became elusive as the sword sang lullabies of destruction, and his dreams filled with visions of a world purged clean by his blade, empty save for himself and the weapon that had made him master of all. He surveyed. The end came not in battle, as befitted a warrior of his stature, but in his wedding chamber, in what should have been his moment of greatest triumph. Attila had just married Ildiko, a Gothic princess whose beauty was said to rival Helen of Troy, and the wedding feast had lasted 3 days. wine flowing like rivers, while the greatest warriors of the Hunnic Empire celebrated their king's happiness. But when morning came, servants found their lord dead in his bed. Blood pooled beneath his head, his new bride cowering in the corner with terror-widened eyes. The official cause was given as a burst blood vessel, a mundane end for a king who had redefined the boundaries of the possible. But those who knew the truth whispered of the sword of Mars, lying beside its master's body, its blade gleaming wet with blood that should not have been there. The weapon's curse had finally claimed its greatest victim, demanding payment for all the power it had granted. Perhaps Attila had tried to renounce it in his moment of mortal happiness, seeking to lay down the burden of divine warfare for the simple joys of love and family. Perhaps the sword, sensing his weakness, had turned upon him as it had always promised to do. Or perhaps, as the darkest legends suggest, the blade had simply grown tired of its current wielder and decided to seek a new hand worthy of its gifts. With Attila's death, the Hunnic Empire collapsed like a structure built of dreams and fear. His sons fought over the succession, while his enemies carved up his territories, and within a generation, the name that had terrified two continents was remembered only in stories told to frighten children. But the sword of Mars survived its master's fall, passing into hands that craved its power while remaining blind to its cost. Through the dark centuries that followed the fall of Rome, the weapon surfaced in the grip of conquerors and tyrants, each believing themselves destined to surpass Attila's achievements. Visigothic kings carried it across Iberia, only to fall to Moorish conquest. Frankish warriors wielded it in battles that reshaped Europe, then died choking on their own blood as the sword turned against them in their moment of triumph. The pattern never varied: meteoric rise, followed by sudden, violent fall, as if the weapon were testing each bearer's worthiness before passing judgment and seeking a new master. Chronicles from the medieval period speak of the cursed blade of the scourge, a weapon that granted victory in exchange for the soul, that made kings of peasants and corpses of kings with equal facility. The last confirmed sighting of the sword of Mars came during the Crusades, when a Norman lord claimed to have discovered it in the ruins of a Byzantine monastery. He used it to carve out a principality in Outremer, ruling with an iron hand until the day he mysteriously vanished, leaving behind only a pool of blood and the whispered testimony of servants who claimed they had seen him arguing with his own sword in the hours before his disappearance. Since then, the weapon has become the stuff of legend and scholarly speculation. Some claim it was destroyed by Christian zealots who recognized its pagan origins. Others insist it lies hidden in some remote monastery vault, too dangerous to display, but too historically significant to destroy. The most romantic stories place it still buried in the steppes where it first emerged, waiting for another hand worthy of its terrible gifts. But perhaps the truth is simpler and more terrible than any legend dares admit. Perhaps the sword of Mars exists not as a physical object, but as an idea, a possibility that whispers to every soul hungry for power beyond mortal limits. In every tyrant's rise and every empire's fall, in every moment when mortal ambition reaches beyond human bounds, the spirit of that ancient blade continues its work, granting victory and demanding payment. making gods of mortals and corpses of gods with the same inexorable logic that has governed its existence since the world was young. The steppes lie quiet tonight, but beneath their silence runs the eternal hunger of power, seeking new vessels, new souls brave enough or foolish enough to believe they can wield divine gifts without paying divine prices. And in that hunger, the sword of Mars lives on, patient as winter, inevitable as dawn, waiting for the next hero, ready to discover that some prices are too high for any mortal heart to pay. In the treasure chambers of Westminster, where the regalia of England gather dust between coronations and the crown jewels sleep in their bulletproof cases, there once sat a throne carved from ivory, pure as mountain snow and smooth as an infant's dreams. The ivory throne of Canute the Great, they called it, though greatness proved a fleeting companion to those who dared to rest their mortal weight upon its ancient seat. King Canute ruled from 1016 to 1035, his dominion stretching across the north sea like some Viking dream made manifest. England, Denmark, Norway, 3 kingdoms bowed before his will, their crowns gathered like trophies in his mighty hands. But earthly power, however vast, seemed insufficient for a king whose ambitions matched the very tides he famously commanded to retreat. He required a throne worthy of his imperial vision, a seat that would speak of permanence in an age when kingdoms rose and fell like morning mist. The ivory came from the distant corners of the known world, tusks of elephants that had walked the African plains under stars older than human memory, carved by craftsmen whose names have been swallowed by time, but whose skill echoed with each curve and flourish. Months of labor went into its creation. Master carvers working by candlelight in palace workshops, their tools singing against the precious material as they shaped raw ivory into a monument to royal power. The finished throne stood like a frozen waterfall, its white surface flowing in carved waves that seemed to move in peripheral vision. The armrests terminated in the heads of narwhals, their tusks intertwining to form supports that bore the weight of kings. The back rose in a series of panels depicting scenes from Norse mythology: Odin hanging from Yggdrasil, Thor battling the Midgard serpent, the death of Balder, and the promise of Ragnarok. Each figure seemed alive in the ivory, caught in eternal motion, their eyes following whoever dared to sit upon the throne. Canute ruled from his ivory seat for nearly 20 years, dispensing justice and commanding armies, receiving tribute and planning conquests. The throne became the symbol of his power, the axis around which his empire turned. Visitors to his court spoke in awed whispers of the way candlelight played across its carved surfaces, how the king seemed to glow with reflected radiance when he held court from its snowy heights. But even Canute, great as he was, remained mortal, and when death claimed him in 1035, the throne passed to his son Harald Harefoot. The young king ascended to his father's seat with all the confidence of inherited authority. But almost immediately, shadow began to gather around his reign. Rival claimants emerged from every corner of the empire, each asserting their own right to the throne. Civil war erupted across England as brother fought brother, and Harold found himself fighting not just for his crown, but for his very survival. The curse worked subtly at first, as curses often do. Harold's advisors began to die in mysterious circumstances, one found drowned in a fishing pond, despite being an excellent swimmer. Another discovered in his chambers with no mark of violence, but his face twisted in an expression of absolute terror. The king himself began to suffer from strange ailments, sudden fevers that came and went like tides, dreams filled with the sound of ivory cracking and the whisper of ancient voices speaking in languages that predated English itself. Harold Harefoot died in 1040, barely 5 years after ascending the throne, his death as mysterious as it was sudden. Some claimed poison, others blamed the stress of constant warfare. But those closest to the court whispered of something more sinister, how they had found the king in his throne room in the early morning hours, slumped forward in his ivory seat, as if the throne itself had claimed his life during the darkest hour of night. The throne passed to Harthacnut, Harold's half-brother, who had spent years fighting for his inheritance from his base in Denmark. But the ivory seat proved no more hospitable to the new king than it had to his predecessor. Harthacnut's reign lasted only 2 years, marked by brutal taxation and increasingly erratic behavior that alienated even his most loyal supporters. He died suddenly in 1042, collapsing at a wedding feast while raising his cup in a toast, his heart stopping as if some invisible hand had squeezed the life from it. With Harthacnut's death, the line of Canute ended, and the throne passed to Edward the Confessor, the Anglo-Saxon prince who would become England's last king before the Norman conquest. Edward, perhaps recognizing the dark reputation that had begun to surround the ivory throne, rarely used it for official ceremonies, preferring simpler seats that carried no whispers of doom. But the throne remained in the palace, its carved figures seeming to watch and wait for the next soul bold enough to claim its deadly embrace. The Norman conquest of 1066 brought new rulers to England, but it also brought a French sensibility that looked askance at Anglo-Saxon traditions and Danish superstitions. William the Conqueror, practical man that he was, ordered the ivory throne dismantled, its precious material carved up and distributed among his supporters as rewards for their loyalty in battle. Better to scatter the pieces than risk whatever. Curse had claimed 3 kings in less than 30 years, the fragments scattered across medieval Europe like seeds of misfortune. Norman nobles incorporated pieces of Canute's thrown into their own furniture, creating chairs and tables that gleamed with ivory beauty but carried within them the memory of royal doom. Within years, unexpected deaths, financial ruin that struck like lightning from clear skies. One Norman lord commissioned an ivory writing desk from fragments of the throne, only to die of a mysterious wasting disease while composing letters at its gleaming surface. A bishop who owned ivory candlesticks carved from the throne's armrests found his cathedral consumed by fire that started nowhere and burned nothing but his personal possessions. A merchant who traded in ivory relics discovered that every piece connected to Canute's throne brought ruin to its purchaser, until he was forced to dump his entire stock into the English Channel rather than risk further curses upon his head. By the 13th century, most of the throne's fragments had disappeared, lost to time or deliberately destroyed by owners who had learned to fear their beautiful burden. But ivory, like ivory's curse, has a way of surviving even determined attempts at destruction. Pieces continued to surface through the centuries, a carved chess piece here, a decorative inlay there, each carrying with it whispers of its royal origin and the doom that followed in its wake. Today, scholars debate whether any genuine fragments of Canute's throne survive in museums or private collections. The Victoria and Albert Museum houses several medieval ivory carvings that some claim descended from the royal seat, though their provenance remains disputed. Collectors occasionally offer pieces at auction, their catalogs speaking carefully of possibly associated with and traditionally attributed to legal language designed to protect against lawsuits while acknowledging the dark glamour that surrounds anything connected to the cursed throne. Perhaps the real curse of Canute's throne lies not in supernatural forces, but in the weight of expectation itself, the impossible burden placed upon those who would rule over others. Every king who sat upon that ivory seat carried the hopes and fears of millions, the responsibility for life and death, prosperity and ruin. Perhaps what destroyed Harold Harefoot and Harthacnot, responsibility without breaking beneath its weight. Or perhaps, as the old stories whisper, some objects are simply born under unlucky stars, cursed from the moment of their creation with the power to destroy those who would claim them. The ivory that formed Canute's throne came from creatures that had roamed free under African skies, taken by force and transformed into symbols of human dominance. Maybe their spirits, trapped within carved prison walls, sought revenge upon those who would sit in judgment of the world, while resting upon the bones of the murdered innocent. The Thames flows past Westminster tonight, its dark waters carrying the memory of all the blood that has stained English history, all the crowns that have risen and fallen in the endless dance of mortal ambition. And somewhere in that historical current, the ghost of an ivory throne continues to drift, beautiful and terrible, waiting for the next soul brave enough to believe they can rule the world without being ruled in turn by the weight of their own impossible dreams in the shadow of Constantinople's golden domes, where the dying light of empire flickered against barbarian darkness. There once gleamed a chalice that held more than wine, wrought from gold, pure as imperial ambition, and studded with gems bright as captured stars. It bore upon its rim an inscription that few dared to read and none dared to speak aloud. The chalice of Emperor Valens, they whispered in the marble corridors of the great palace, though its true name was written in letters that burned the eyes and scorched the soul. Valens ruled the Eastern Roman Empire from 364 to 378. His reign a desperate attempt to hold back the tide of history itself, while barbarian tribes pressed against the Danube frontier and religious controversies tore the empire apart from within. The emperor sought solace in the ancient rituals of imperial power. Among the treasures of the purple, none held greater significance than his personal chalice, the golden cup from which he drank the wine that sealed his fate. The vessel had been crafted by the finest artisans of the capital, their skills honed by generations of service to the throne. But this was no ordinary commission, no simple addition to the imperial regalia. The emperor had specified certain requirements, certain inscriptions that were to be carved into the gold itself. Words that spoke not of Christian salvation, but of older, darker forms of eternal life around the chalice's rim, in letters so small they seemed like decorative flourishes to casual observers. ran an inscription in archaic Greek: "Let no grave hold me, let no death claim me, let vengeance flow eternal from this cup." Below it, in Latin characters that seemed to shift and writhe when viewed in candlelight, mors tua, vita me, your death, my life. And beneath that, in symbols that belonged to no Christian language, words that predated Christ, early years of his reign, its wine sweet as honey, its gold warm as summer sunlight. Valens would drink from it during state banquets and religious ceremonies, feeling power flow through him like liquid fire. The cup seemed to grant him clarity in times of confusion, strength in moments of weakness, the wisdom to navigate the treacherous currents of imperial politics. But power freely given is power that demands payment, and the chalice's gifts came with a price that revealed itself slowly, like poison working through imperial veins. The emperor began to change, his mercy curdling into cruelty, his justice becoming arbitrary and harsh. The wine that once brought wisdom now brought paranoia, and Valens saw enemies in every shadow, treason in every whispered conversation. The transformation reached its climax in his persecution of Orthodox Christians, as the Arian emperor wielded the power of the state against those who dared to disagree with his theological positions. The chalice seemed to glow with inner fire during these campaigns of suppression, its gold reflecting the flames of burning churches, its gems sparkling with the light of martyrs' pyres. But the curse that Valens had inscribed upon his cup worked both ways, and the vengeance he had invoked began to turn against him. In 378, the Visigoths crossed the Danube in force, their movement not just a migration, but a divine judgment upon an empire that had forgotten the price of earthly power. At the Battle of Adrianople, on a field that would be forever stained with Roman blood, the emperor led his army to destruction. The battle began at dawn on August 9th, with Roman legions arranged in perfect formation, their shields gleaming like scales on some great metal serpent. Valens rode among them on his warhorse, the golden chalice secured in his personal baggage train, its wine already transformed into something darker than blood, more bitter than defeat. The Visigothic warriors faced them across the field like incarnations of divine wrath, their weapons thirsting for imperial blood, their hearts burning with the fire of righteous rebellion. When the armies met, heaven itself seemed to weep blood. Roman discipline crumbled before barbarian fury, the legions that had conquered the world falling like wheat before the scythe. In the chaos of defeat, as his empire died around him, Valens found himself surrounded by enemy warriors, their spears hungry for imperial flesh. The manner of his death became the stuff of legend and nightmare. Some said he fell beneath Visigothic swords, his body lost among the thousands of Roman dead. Others claimed he was captured alive and burned to death in a peasant's hut, the flames consuming not just his flesh, but the very memory of his reign. But the darkest stories whispered that he died clutching his golden chalice, drinking deep of its cursed wine as fire consumed his flesh, sealing his fate with the very cup that had promised him eternal life. With the emperor's death, the chalice vanished into the chaos of defeat, claimed perhaps by barbarian looters who saw only gold and gems, blind to the darker treasures they carried away from the field of slaughter. But objects of such power do not disappear easily, and within years, stories began to surface of a golden cup that brought doom to all who drank from it. Through the dark centuries that followed Rome's fall, the chalice surfaced in the courts of barbarian kings and Christian emperors, always accompanied by the same pattern of rise and ruin. Theodoric the Great drank from it at his victory feast and died choking on his own suspicions. Justinian's general Belisarius used it to toast his conquests and found himself disgraced and blinded by his imperial master. The cup seemed to seek out those who held power, offering them one final toast before claiming them as payment for Valen's ancient curse. The Crusades brought the chalice into the possession of Latin princes, who saw in its golden beauty a fitting symbol of their divine mission. But the Holy Land proved no sanctuary from its influence, and Crusader lords who drank from it found their principalities crumbling, their alliances turning to ash, their dreams of Christian empire dissolving like wine mixed with poison. The last confirmed appearance of Valen's chalice came during the Fourth Crusade, when the armies of Christ turned their weapons against Constantinople itself, sacking the city that had been the last bastion of Roman glory. Among the treasures looted from the great palace was a golden cup bearing inscriptions in languages that the Frankish knights could not read, its beauty so great that they claimed it must have held the wine at Cana or the blood at Calvary. But the cup brought no blessing to its new owners, and within a generation the Latin Empire of Constantinople had collapsed, its territories carved up among enemies who showed the same mercy that the Crusaders had once shown to the city they destroyed. The chalice disappeared again, perhaps melted down for its gold, perhaps hidden away by monks who recognized the danger it represented, perhaps simply lost in the chaos of yet another empire's fall. Today, museums across Europe house golden chalices that claim descent from Byzantine imperial treasure, their curators speaking carefully of possible connections and attributed histories. But none bear the inscriptions that marked Valen's cup. None carry the weight of imperial curses sealed in precious metal and sealed with blood. Perhaps the chalice survives, still, hidden in some private collection or monastery vault, its gold untarnished by time, its curse undiminished by centuries. Perhaps it was destroyed long ago, its metal reformed into coins or ornaments that carry no memory of their imperial origin. Or perhaps, as the darkest legends suggest, it exists now not as a physical object but as a possibility, a promise that power can be purchased with the right words, the right wine, the right willingness to bind one's soul to eternal service. The ruins of Constantinople lie beneath modern Istanbul, their marble columns supporting mosques and museums, their imperial memories buried under centuries of Turkish soil. But somewhere in that historical sediment, in the dreams of archaeologists and the nightmares of historians, the ghost of a golden chalice continues to gleam, offering one final toast to all who would trade their souls for temporal power, promising eternal life while delivering only eternal damnation. In the summer of 1941, when Hitler's armies rolled across the Russian steppes like some mechanized apocalypse and Stalin's empire teetered on the brink of collapse, Soviet archaeologists made a discovery that would link ancient curse to modern catastrophe, binding the dead hand of a Mongol conqueror to the living nightmare of global war. In a tomb that had guarded its secrets for over 5 centuries, they found the jade death mask of Timur the Lame, and with it, a warning that echoed across the centuries like thunder before the storm. Timur had ruled his empire from that jewel of Central Asia, where caravans converged like streams flowing into an ocean of wealth and power. He was called Tamerlane by his European enemies, a name that carried within it the weight of fear and the certainty of doom. From 1370 to 1405, his armies had swept across the known world like the wrath of ancient gods, building pyramids of skulls in conquered cities, leaving behind him a wake of destruction so complete that grass would not grow in the footprints of his horses. When death finally claimed him in 1405, as he prepared for the conquest of China itself, Timur was entombed with all the ceremony due to a man who had reshaped the world through will and sword. His body was laid to rest in the Guriamir Mausoleum in Samarkand, wrapped in silk and gold, surrounded by treasures that represented the wealth of a dozen conquered kingdoms. But most significant of all was the jade death mask that covered his face, carved from stone so dark it seemed to drink light itself, its features capturing not the decay of death, but the eternal authority of imperial power. Upon the tomb's entrance, master calligraphers had inscribed warnings in Persian and Arabic, their elegant scripts forming words that spoke of consequences that would outlive empires. When I rise from the dead, the world shall tremble. Below it, in letters smaller but no less ominous, whosoever disturbs my tomb will unleash an invader more terrible than I. For over 5 centuries, the warnings held their power, and Timur's tomb remained inviolate. Local rulers, however desperate for treasure, dared not disturb the rest of a conqueror whose name still whispered across the steppes like wind through ruins. Even grave robbers, those fearless seekers of ancient gold, gave the mausoleum a wide berth, leaving offerings at its entrance rather than risk the fulfillment of prophecies carved in stone. But the 20th century brought new kinds of men, armed with scientific rationalism and Soviet materialism, who saw in ancient warnings nothing more than superstition designed to protect medieval treasure hoards. In June 1941, as German armies massed on the western borders of the USSR, archaeologist Mikhail Gerasimov arrived in Samarkand with official permission to excavate the tomb. His mission, sanctioned by the highest levels of Soviet authority, Gerasimov was a man of impeccable scientific credentials, famous for his ability to reconstruct faces from ancient skulls, to bring the dead back to life through careful application of anatomical knowledge and artistic skill. He approached Timur's tomb with the confidence of a scholar who had opened dozens of ancient graves without consequence, who saw in medieval warnings nothing more than primitive psychology designed to protect valuable burial goods. The excavation began on June 20th, 1941, with all the ceremony due to a significant archaeological undertaking. Soviet officials attended, photographers documented every stage of the process, and radio broadcasts carried news of the project across the USSR. The tomb's outer chambers yielded treasures beyond imagination: golden vessels, precious manuscripts, weapons inlaid with gems that caught the light like captured stars. But it was the inner sanctum that held the greatest prize. There, in a sarcophagus of black jade that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, lay the mortal remains of Timur himself. The conqueror's body had been preserved by the dry climate of Samarkand, his features still recognizable despite 5 centuries of rest. And covering his face like a second skin was the jade death mask, its dark surface polished to mirror brightness, its carved features more beautiful and terrible than life itself. Gerasimov lifted the mask with hands that trembled not from fear, but from scholarly excitement. Here was a direct link to one of history's most significant figures, an artifact that would allow him to reconstruct the true face of a man whose name had shaken the medieval world. The jade felt warm to his touch, as if some inner fire still burned within the stone, and when he held it to the light, he could swear he saw depths within its surface that had nothing to do with the physical properties of carved rock. The mask was photographed, measured, and carefully packed for transport to Moscow, where Gerasimov intended to use it as the basis for a facial reconstruction that would show the Soviet people what their great predecessor had truly looked like. But even as the archaeological team celebrated their success, forces were already in motion that would transform their scientific triumph into historical catastrophe. On June 22, 1941, just 2 days after Timur's mask had been removed from its resting place, the largest military operation in human history began. Operation Barbarossa saw over 3 million German troops cross the Soviet frontier in a coordinated assault that stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Hitler had unleashed his war machine against Stalin's empire, and the prophecy carved on Timur's tomb began to fulfill itself with the precision of clockwork and the inevitability of destiny. The invasion caught Soviet forces completely unprepared, despite intelligence warnings that had been ignored or dismissed. By Stalin's paranoia, entire armies were encircled and destroyed in the opening weeks. Millions of soldiers marching into German captivity while their equipment fell into enemy hands. Cities that had stood unconquered for centuries burned under German bombardment, and the socialist paradise that Lenin had built seemed destined to join the Mongol Empire in history's catalogue of vanished dreams. As German armies raced toward Moscow, and Leningrad, as the map of Europe, was redrawn in blood and fire. The jade mask of Timur rode in a carefully climate-controlled case toward the Soviet capital. Gerasimov, fleeing westward with his precious cargo, could not have failed to notice the timing. The way ancient prophecy and modern catastrophe had converged with such terrible precision. Local residents of Samarkand, watching the archaeological team depart with their ancient treasure, shook their heads with the weary wisdom of people who had seen empires rise and fall like seasonal floods. They had warned the Russians, had spoken of the curse that protected Timur's rest, had pleaded with them to leave the dead conqueror in peace. Now, as news of German victories poured in over radio broadcasts, they could only pray that the invader Timur had promised would prove less terrible than the one he had been. The mask spent the war years in storage, locked away while the Soviet Union bled and fought and ultimately triumphed over the German invasion. Stalin's empire survived, but at a cost that beggared description. 27 million dead, cities reduced to rubble, a generation scarred by trauma that would echo through decades of Cold War fears. The prophecy had been fulfilled with a precision that would have impressed even Timur himself. The disturber of his tomb had indeed unleashed an invader more terrible than the Mongol conqueror, and the world had trembled beneath the weight of mechanized warfare. After the war, Soviet authorities quietly returned the jade mask to Samarkand, installing it not in Timur's tomb, but in a museum where it could be studied and displayed, without risking further fulfillment of ancient curses. The official explanation spoke of preserving historical artifacts for the education of the people. But those who had lived through the excavation and the invasion that followed understood the deeper truth. Some sleeping powers are too dangerous to disturb. Today, the mask rests in the State Museum of the History of Uzbekistan, displayed in a case that speaks of scientific rationalism and historical preservation. Tourists photograph it daily, reading placards that explain its historical significance and archaeological importance. But the museum guides, when pressed, will sometimes speak in hushed tones of the timing of its discovery. The way ancient prophecy and modern catastrophe had converged with such devastating precision. Perhaps the connection was mere coincidence, the kind of temporal alignment that human pattern-seeking minds impose upon random events. Perhaps Hitler had always planned his invasion for the summer of 1941, and the disturbance of Timur's tomb was simply an archaeological accident that happened to align with military necessity. Perhaps the prophecy carved on that ancient mausoleum was nothing more than medieval bravado, designed to protect a conqueror's rest through psychological intimidation rather than supernatural intervention. But perhaps some powers transcend the boundaries between life and death, between past and present, between the rational and the mystical. Perhaps Timur, lying in his jade-shrouded sleep, had indeed bound his curse to the disturbance of his rest, reaching across 5 centuries to fulfill his promise that the world would tremble when his slumber was broken. The jade mask gleams behind museum glass tonight, its dark surface reflecting the faces of tourists and scholars who come to study its historical significance. But beneath that polished exterior lies a deeper mystery, a question that connects ancient conquest to modern catastrophe, medieval prophecy to 20th century warfare. In the end, perhaps the nature of the curse matters less than its persistence. Way human actions continue to echo across the centuries, the way the dead hand of the past continues to shape the living world, the way some promises, once made, are kept with a faithfulness that outlasts empires and transcends the very notion of death itself. In the shadow of the Hagia Sophia, where Christian prayers once rose like incense toward heaven's golden dome and Islamic chants now echo through Byzantine stone, there once gleamed a tablet of emerald, so pure it seemed to hold captured starlight within its crystalline depths. The emerald tablet of Constantine the Great, they whispered in the marble corridors of the great palace, though its true origin lay in mysteries older than Christianity, older than Rome itself, reaching back to the dawn of human ambition and the first mad dream of eternal power. Constantine had claimed it during his conquest of Byzantium, when the ancient Greek city surrendered its treasures to become the new Rome that would bear his name for 1,000 years. Among the accumulated wisdom of ages scrolls from the Library of Alexandria, statues carved by masters whose names had become legend, golden vessels that had once graced the tables of gods, the emerald tablet stood alone in its mystery, and magnificence. The artifact itself defied easy description. Its surface neither fully opaque nor entirely transparent, but something between the two that seemed to shift depending upon the angle of view and the purity of the observer's heart. Upon its face, carved in letters so fine they might have been traced by angels themselves, ran inscriptions in a dozen languages: Greek and Latin, Hebrew and Egyptian hieroglyphs, symbols that belonged to no earthly tongue but seemed to carry meaning that bypassed the mind and spoke directly to the soul. The words spoke of secrets that kings had died to possess, of alchemical formulas that could transmute base metal into gold, of the hidden connections between earth and heaven, matter and spirit, time and eternity. As above, so below, ran one line. Its simple words carrying within them the key to mysteries that had puzzled philosophers since thought first stirred in human minds. Is like that which is below to accomplish the miracles of the one thing. Constantine studied the tablet with the intensity of a man who had seen divine visions and spoke with Christ himself, one through will and sword and the mysterious workings of providence. In the emerald's depths he saw reflections of his own imperial destiny, confirmation that his conversion and conquests were part of some grand design that connected earthly power to heavenly purpose. The tablet became his most prized possession, consulted before every major decision, its cryptic wisdom interpreted through prayer and meditation that lasted long into the Constantinople nights. When he faced the challenge of establishing a new capital, the emerald whispered of the perfect confluence of Europe and Asia, of the strategic importance of controlling the passage between seas. When theological disputes threatened to tear his Christian empire apart, its green depths revealed the importance of doctrinal unity, of councils that could establish orthodoxy through imperial authority. For years, it seemed the tablet's wisdom guided Constantine to triumph after triumph. The Council of Nicaea established Christian doctrine on foundations that would endure for millennia. Constantinople rose from Byzantine foundations to become the most magnificent city in the world. The Roman Empire, renewed through Christian transformation, appeared destined for eternal glory under the protection of divine providence and emerald wisdom. But the tablet's gifts, like all supernatural boons, came with prices that revealed themselves slowly, like poison working through imperial veins. Constantine began to change, his Christian charity curdling into paranoid suspicion, his wisdom becoming cold calculation that saw enemies in every shadow. The emerald that had once shown him divine truth now whispered of threats that required increasingly harsh responses. The transformation reached its climax in his treatment of his own family, as the emperor who had shown mercy to defeated enemies turned his suspicions upon his own blood. His eldest son, Crispus, hero of naval battles and heir to the purple, fell victim to court intrigue and imperial paranoia, executed on charges that historians still debate. Constantine's wife, Fausta, met a similar fate, boiled alive in her bath, on the emperor's orders. Victim of the same cold logic that the tablet seemed to encourage in its bearer's heart, when Constantine died in 337, preparing for baptism that would wash away the sins of a lifetime spent in pursuit of earthly power. The emerald tablet passed to his sons, along with the divided empire and the accumulated weight of imperial crimes. But the artifact's curse had only begun to work its patient magic, and the dynasty that had seemed blessed by heaven itself began to crumble with the same systematic thoroughness that had marked its rise. Constantine II died in battle against his own brother, victim of the civil wars that tore the empire apart as the imperial heirs fought over their father's legacy. Constans fell to an assassin's blade, his body left unburied while usurpers carved up his territories. Constantius II survived longest, but his reign was marked by the same paranoid cruelty that had claimed his father's final years. His court a place of whispers and sudden disappearances, where the emerald tablet glowed with malevolent beauty in its secret shrine. Through the centuries that followed, the tablet passed from hand to hand, each new owner convinced they could master its secrets without paying its price. Byzantine emperors clutched it close while their empire shrank like melting ice, their territories carved away by barbarians and Arabs who seemed immune to the emerald's promised wisdom. The tablet survived the iconoclastic controversies and the Great Schism, the rise of Islam and the coming of the Turks. Its green surface unmarked by time, while empires rose and fell around it like waves breaking against eternal stone. The Fourth Crusade brought Latin knights to Constantinople's gates, and among the treasures they carried west was an emerald tablet, whose beauty caught every eye and whose inscriptions promised wisdom beyond mortal comprehension. But the Latin Empire they established lasted barely 60 years. Its brief existence, a testament to the tablet's ability to grant power while withholding the wisdom necessary to maintain it. When Constantinople fell to the Turks in 1453, the emerald tablet vanished into the chaos of conquest, claimed perhaps by Ottoman officials who saw in its beauty evidence of God's favor, or by European scholars who recognized its hermetic significance and spirited it west to safety. For centuries, rumors placed it in various locations: the Vatican's secret archives, the private collections of Medici princes, the laboratories of alchemists who sought to unlock its secrets through fire and prayer. The Renaissance brought renewed interest in hermetic wisdom, and several European courts claimed to possess Constantine's emerald tablet, each version accompanied by elaborate provenance tales and scholarly attestations. But none seemed to carry the full weight of the original's power. None brought to their owners the combination of insight and doom that had marked the artifact's previous history. Perhaps the real tablet was destroyed in one of history's countless conflagrations, its emerald surface shattered and its wisdom scattered to the winds. Perhaps it was deliberately hidden by guardians who understood too well the price of the power it offered. Age. Or perhaps, as the Hermetic traditions suggest, it exists now, not as a physical object, but as an idea, a possibility that whispers to every soul hungry for knowledge that transcends mortal limitations. The emerald tablet lives on in the traditions of alchemy and Hermetic philosophy, its supposed words preserved in manuscripts that claim descent from the original but carry within them only shadows of the true. Artifacts' power, of theologians parsing ancient sources and archaeological evidence in search of proof that may forever remain elusive. But perhaps the tablet's greatest curse is not supernatural, but philosophical. The way it represents humanity's eternal hunger for shortcuts to wisdom, for formulas that can bypass the slow work of moral development and spiritual growth. Every age produces its seekers after emerald tablets. its hunters of philosophers' stones, its believers in the possibility that ultimate truth can be possessed like any other treasure, rather than earned through the patient work of a lifetime, spent in service to something greater than the self. The ruins of Constantinople lie beneath Istanbul's modern bustle, their marble columns supporting mosques and museums, their imperial memories buried under centuries of Turkish soil. But somewhere in that historical sediment, in the dreams of archaeologists and the fantasies of fortune hunters, the ghost of an emerald tablet continues to gleam, promising wisdom to all who seek it, while delivering understanding only to those wise enough to recognize that some truths are too dangerous for mortal minds to hold. In the shadow of the pyramids, it seemed to capture the very essence of the sun god Ra himself, shaped like the eye of Horus, that ancient symbol of protection and royal power. It had rested upon the breast of Pharaoh Shoshenq for over 3 millennia, guarding his eternal sleep until the day when European hands disturbed his rest and unleashed a curse that would echo through drawing rooms and auction houses like the whisper of desert wind through violated tombs. Shoshenq had ruled Egypt from 943 to 922 BCE, founder of the 22nd dynasty, the Libyan pharaoh who restored Egyptian power after centuries of decline. His name appears in biblical texts as Shishak, the king who sacked Solomon's temple and carried away its treasures. Significance than the golden eye that watched over his mummified form, its pupil set with a sapphire so dark it seemed to hold the depths of night itself. The amulet had been crafted by the finest goldsmiths of Memphis, their skills honed by generations of service to the divine pharaohs. The gold itself was ritual pure, mined from Nubian deposits that were said to be the flesh of the gods, refined in temple furnaces where priests chanted prayers over every gram of precious metal. The sapphire at its center came from the distant mines of Ceylon, carried along trade routes that connected the Nile to the edges of the known world. But this was more than mere jewelry. Upon its reverse side, in hieroglyphs so fine they could barely be read without magnification, ran inscriptions that spoke of divine protection and terrible vengeance. The eye of Horus watches eternal. The pharaoh's rest shall know the burning of the desert sun, the thirst that no water can quench, the darkness that follows those who steal the light of kings. For over 2.5 millennia, the curse held its power, and Shoshenq's tomb remained inviolate. The Persians conquered Egypt, the Greeks built Alexandria, the Romans made the Nile a province of their empire. Even grave robbers, those fearless seekers of ancient gold, seemed to sense something dangerous about the burial site. 19th century brought new kinds of men to Egypt's ancient sites, armed with scientific curiosity and European confidence in their ability to master any mystery through reason and methodology. Among these was Sir Reginald Ashworth, a British collector whose passion for Egyptian antiquities was matched only by his ability to finance excavations through his family's industrial fortune. In 1857, following leads discovered in papyrus fragments, purchased from dealers in Cairo, Ashworth's expedition located what appeared to be an intact royal burial in the cliffs west of Thebes. The tomb entrance bore cartouches identifying it as the resting place of Shoshenq I, and the British collector felt his heart race with the knowledge that he was about to become the first modern man to look upon the face of a biblical pharaoh. The Excavation proceeded with all the ceremony appropriate to such a momentous discovery. Photographs documented every stage of the process, while careful drawings recorded the position of each artifact before its removal. The tomb's outer chambers yielded treasures beyond imagination: golden vessels, precious amulets, furniture inlaid with ivory and precious stones. Chamber that held the greatest prize. There, within sarcophagi, nested like jeweled boxes, lay the pharaoh himself, his wrappings still intact after 3,000 years of desert preservation. And upon his breast, glowing in the lamplight, like a captured star, lay the golden eye of Horus, its sapphire center reflecting the excavators' faces with an intensity that seemed almost alive. Ashworth lifted the amulet with hands that trembled, not from age, but from scholarly excitement. Here was a direct link to biblical history, a treasure that had witnessed the glory of Solomon's temple and the power of ancient Egypt at its zenith. The gold felt warm to his touch, warmer than the desert air could account for. And when he held it to the light, he could swear he saw depths within the sapphire that spoke of mysteries older than civilization itself. The amulet joined Ashworth's collection, packed carefully for the journey to his estate in Yorkshire, where it would take pride of place among artifacts gathered from a dozen excavations. But even as the British collector celebrated his success, forces were already in motion that would transform his triumph. Within weeks of the amulet's arrival in England, Sir Reginald began to complain of strange dreams, visions of ancient Egypt that seemed more real than his waking hours. He would wake in the middle of the night, his sheets soaked with sweat, speaking of golden eyes that watched him from the darkness, and voices that whispered in languages he did not understand, but somehow comprehended his health. Robust, despite his 63 years, began to deteriorate in ways that puzzled his physicians. A persistent fever came and went like desert heat, burning him during the day and leaving him chilled and shaking through the long Yorkshire nights. His appetite vanished, though he claimed the food tasted of sand and bitter herbs that reminded him of embalming spices. The symptoms worsened after he had the amulet mounted in a display case in his library. The eye of Horus seemed to follow everyone who entered the room, its sapphire pupil tracking movement with an awareness that belonged to living things rather than carved stone and precious metal. Sir Reginald died in the winter of 1858, less than a year after discovering Shoshank's tomb. His body wasted, despite the best efforts of London's most skilled physicians. His death certificate attributed his passing to complications from a tropical fever. But those who knew him best whispered of the way he had wasted away, as if something vital was being drawn from his very essence by forces beyond mortal understanding. The amulet passed to his nephew, Charles Ashworth, a young man whose skepticism regarding ancient curses lasted exactly 3 months. By spring, he too was experiencing the same symptoms that had claimed his uncle: the fever, the dreams, the growing obsession with the golden eye that seemed to watch him from its case with malevolent intelligence. His uncle, perhaps because youth fought off the curse's influence more effectively, but he too succumbed within 2 years. The eye of Horus passed through the hands of collectors and dealers. Each new owner initially delighted with their acquisition. The amulet developed a reputation in antiquarian circles as cursed, its very name whispered with the kind of reverent fear usually reserved for objects of supernatural power. One owner attempted to break the curse through Christian exorcism, inviting bishops to bless the amulet and pray over its malevolent influence. The golden eye seemed to glow brighter during the ceremony, dancing within its depths. The bishop performing the ritual collapsed during the prayers, struck down by what physicians called a sudden heart attack, but what observers described as divine judgment upon those who would use Christian rites against Egyptian gods. Another collector tried to neutralize the curse through separation, keeping the amulet in a vault while studying it only through photographs and detailed drawings. But the eye of Horus seemed to reach across physical distance, appearing in his dreams with such vividness that he began to sleepwalk. By the dawn of the 20th century, the amulet had acquired such a dark reputation that reputable auction houses refused to handle it, and insurance companies would not provide coverage for collections that included it. The Eye of Horus dropped out of public sight, passing through the underground networks of occult collectors and private dealers, who specialized in objects too dangerous for legitimate commerce. Today, the amulet's location remains unknown, though rumors place it in various private collections around the world. Some claim it was destroyed in the London Blitz, its curse finally ended by German bombs that showed no respect for ancient Egyptian magic. Others insist it survives in the vault of some anonymous collector, its golden surface unmarked by time, its sapphire eye still watching and waiting for the next soul brave enough to disturb the sleep of pharaohs. Perhaps the curse of Shoshenq's amulet was nothing more than coincidence and suggestion, the power of reputation working upon minds already primed for mystery and fear. But perhaps, as the ancient inscriptions warned, some objects carry within them the accumulated power of civilizations, the concentrated authority of gods who ruled when the pyramids were young and the Nile ran red with the blood of those who dared to challenge divine authority. The desert winds blow across Egypt tonight, carrying sand that has witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties, the birth and death of gods, the endless cycle of human ambition that builds monuments to eternity, while remaining bound to mortal flesh. And somewhere in that eternal desert, or perhaps in some climate-controlled vault, half a world away, the Eye of Horus continues its vigil, golden and patient and beautiful as the day it first opened upon the world, waiting for the next handbold, enough to claim what was always meant to remain buried with the pharaohs in their eternal sleep, in the shadow of the Carpathian Mountains, where mist clings to castle walls like unquiet spirits, and the very stones seem stained with the memory of blood. There once gleamed a jewel that bore within its crimson depths the essence of its master's terrible thirst. The bloodstone of Vlad the Impaler, they whispered in the taverns of Targovekt, though its true name was written in the screams of the 20,000 Turkish warriors, whose corpses had decorated the road to his capital like some macabre forest of human suffering. Vlad Gapek ruled Wallachia from 1456 to 1462, his reign brief but terrible enough to echo through 5 centuries of nightmare and legend. He was voivode, defender of Christian lands against Ottoman expansion. The stone he wore upon his breast, a jasper crystal flecked with red like dried blood, was said to pulse with each heart he stopped, to glow brighter with every soul he sent screaming into the darkness. The bloodstone itself predated Vlad's reign by centuries, passed down through the Dracul bloodline like some hereditary curse. Legend claimed it had been carved from a meteorite that fell to Earth during the reign of Mercia the Elder. Its cosmic origins explaining the supernatural powers that seemed to emanate from its crystalline structure. The red flecks within its black matrix were said to be actual blood, preserved within the stone's heart by forces older than Christianity, older than the very mountains that sheltered Wallachia from its enemies. But whatever its origins, the stone found its perfect master in Vlad Gapek, necessary to face enemies that outnumbered his forces 100 to 1. When the young voivode first placed the bloodstone against his breast, cold and predatory as a wolf's gaze in winter darkness, the stone's influence manifested itself most clearly in Vlad's signature method of execution. Impalement had been practiced by many rulers throughout history, but never with the systematic artistry that marked the Wallachian voivode's approach. Under the bloodstone's whispered guidance, he perfected techniques that could keep victims alive for days, their screams providing the soundtrack for state banquets, while their blood nourished the earth around his capital. The jewel seemed to glow brightest during these exhibitions of cruelty, its red flecks pulsing in rhythm with dying heartbeats, its black surface reflecting candlelight in patterns that hurt the eyes to follow. Boyars who attended Vlad's court spoke in whispers of how the stone seemed to drink in the suffering around it, growing warmer against the voivode's chest as each new victim added their voice to the chorus of the damned. The bloodstone's power reached its zenith during Vlad's most famous atrocity, the forest of impaled corpses that greeted Sultan Mehmed II's army as it approached. Targovikt in 1462, 20,000 Ottoman prisoners captured in night raids and border skirmishes had been subjected to the voivode's artistic cruelty, their bodies arranged in perfect geometric patterns that spoke of a mind that found beauty in systematic destruction. As the Sultan's vast army crested the hill and looked down upon this monument to human evil, the bloodstone blazed like a captured star against Vlad's breast, its red flecks seeming to move within the crystal-like living blood, seeking new veins to fill. The psychological impact proved devastating. Veteran janissaries who had conquered half the world fell to their knees and wept, while the Sultan himself ordered an immediate retreat rather than face an enemy whose cruelty exceeded even Ottoman imagination. But power purchased through such means carries its own price, and the bloodstone's gifts came with curses that revealed themselves slowly, like poison working through Wallachian veins. Vlad's own supporters began to turn against him, horrified by cruelties that went beyond military necessity into realms of pure evil. The stone that had granted him victory over the Turks began to isolate him from his own people, who saw in their voivode's eyes something that was no longer entirely human. The end came in 1476, during Vlad's final attempt to reclaim his throne from rivals backed by Hungarian gold and Ottoman steel. In a winter battle near Bucharest, the man who had terrorized the most powerful empire in the world fell to the swords of common soldiers, his head severed and sent to Constantinople as proof that even the most terrible tyrants remain mortal. Beneath their supernatural armor, the bloodstone vanished in the chaos of defeat. But almost immediately, the pattern that would define its subsequent history began to establish itself, meteoric rise, followed by sudden, violent fall, as if the jewel were testing each new owner's capacity for the evil it demanded in exchange for its power. Baron Istvan Bathory claimed the stone as spoils of war. Within months, his own cruelty had become legend throughout Hungary, his castle the scene of tortures that made Vlad's methods seem almost merciful. The Baron's reign of terror lasted 3 years before his own nobles rose against him, his death coming in the same castle where he had practiced refinements on Wallachet, techniques of systematic suffering through the centuries that followed. The bloodstones surfaced in the possession of figures whose names became synonymous with cruelty and sudden doom. Elizabeth Bathory, the Blood Countess herself. She died walled up in her own castle, the bloodstone nowhere to be found. When her chambers were finally opened decades after her death, the stone passed through the hands of Ottoman pashas and Hungarian magnates, Moldavian bojars and Polish nobles, each owner adding their own chapter to its history of blood and betrayal. Always the pattern remained the same. The jewel would grant its bearer power over life and death, the ability to inspire terror in enemies and submission in subjects, but only for as long as they continued to feed its appetite for suffering and death. By the 18th century, the bloodstone had acquired such a dark reputation that even the most ambitious nobles hesitated to claim it, preferring to let it rest in monastery vaults rather than risk the curse that seemed to follow in its wake. The Orthodox monks who guarded it spoke of strange phenomena that surrounded the jewel candles that burned with red flames when it was near, prayer books that opened spontaneously to passages about divine judgment, holy water that boiled when sprinkled upon its surface. The bloodstone vanished entirely during the chaos of World War II, when Romanian treasures were scattered by bombing and looting, revolution and invasion. Some claimed it had been destroyed in the fires that consumed Bucharest during the Soviet advance. Others whispered that it had been spirited away by Iron Guard fanatics who recognized in its power something that matched their own twisted ideologies. Today, rumors place the bloodstone in various private collections around the world, each sighting accompanied by tales of sudden violence and mysterious death. Collectors who specialize in artifacts of historical infamy speak in hushed tones of a jasper crystal that appears occasionally at underground auctions, its price measured not just in money but in the willingness of purchasers to embrace the evil it represents. Perhaps the bloodstone was destroyed long ago, its curse finally ended by forces too powerful for medieval magic to overcome through constant vigilance. Or perhaps, as the darkest legends suggest, it has found the perfect resting place in the hands of someone whose capacity for cruelty matches even Vlad the Impaler's appetite for human suffering. The Carpathian Mountains stand silent tonight, their peaks shrouded in mist that carries no memory of the screams that once echoed through their valleys. But somewhere in that eternal darkness, in the dreams of historians and the nightmares of those who study humanity's capacity for evil, waiting for the next soul ready to trade their humanity for the power to make others suffer in their name. In the ancient kingdom of Sela, warriors, there rang across the mountains a bronze voice so deep and mournful that mothers would cover their children's ears. The divine bell of King Seongdeok the Great, forged in the 8th century when Korea's power stretched from sea to sea. Soul who heard its terrible song King Seongdeok ruled the unified kingdom of Silla from 700 to 2737, his reign marking the golden age of Korean culture when art and literature flourished under the protection of Buddhist wisdom and Confucian governance. But the king's greatest ambition was to create a monument that would outlast dynasties and speak to future generations of the glory that was. Silla bell so magnificent that its voice would carry the prayers of his people directly to the ears of Buddha himself. The bell's creation began in 725, when royal craftsmen gathered bronze from across the kingdom, copper from the mountains of Gangwon, tin from the mines of Jeongju, gold and silver to add brilliance to the alloy. But the master bell founder, a craftsman named Master Wanhyu, whose skill was legendary throughout East Asia, warned the king that such an ambitious project would require more than mere metal to succeed. "Great king," the old craftsman said, his words careful as a monk's prayer, "to create a bell that will speak with the voice of heaven itself requires sacrifice beyond the ordinary. The bronze must be blessed not just with royal gold, but with something far more precious, the pure spirit of one who has never known sin, never tasted corruption, never felt the weight of earthly desire upon their innocent soul." The king understood the implication immediately, though his heart recoiled from its darkness. In the great bell foundries of China, it was whispered, the most perfect instruments were created through offerings that Western minds could never comprehend. Lives given to the furnace flames, their spirits binding with molten metal, to create voices that could reach beyond the mortal world into realms of pure sound and perfect resonance. For months, Seongdeok wrestled with the moral weight of his ambition.